The Court of King's Bench, Westminster, the 21st of November, 1683. A 60-year-old man stands at the bar on a charge of high treason. He has no counsel to argue the facts for him because the law of England in 1683 does not permit a man accused of treason to have one. He argues for his own life and begins by objecting to the jury. Because the jury has been assembled by a sheriff loyal to the crown and he can see what is being done to him. The law he is charged under carries a protection built into it. Treason must be proved by 2 witnesses to an overt act. Not 1, 2. That requirement exists precisely because treason is the charge a government reaches for when it wants a particular man destroyed. And the framers of that safeguard understood that a single well-paved voice is easy to find. The Crown has one witness to the plot. His name is Lord Howard of Essex, and he has already saved his own neck by informing on one of his friends, and nobody in the courtroom, including the men relying on him, regards him as an honest man. So the prosecution reaches for something else. In the summer, when the officers came to arrest this man, they went through his study and carried away his papers. Among those papers was a manuscript. It was long, it was unfinished, it was unpublished, and almost no one on earth had read a word of it. It was an argument about government, that no king holds an unanswerable title handed down from Adam, that power exists for the good of the governed, and that a ruler who turns against his people may lawfully be resisted. The Solicitor General tells the court that the book is an argument for the people to rise up in arms against the king. The defendant answers that anything can be made to say anything if you cut it into pieces. Take the scripture apart the same way, he says, and you can make the penmen of scripture blasphemers. You can have David saying there is no God. You can have the apostles drunk. The Lord Chief Justice is George Jeffreys, whose conduct on a bench was a byword for cruelty in his own time, and he has not improved with age. He instructs the jury on the point of law in 3 words of Latin that translate to write is to act. The man at the bar was Algernon Sidney, and 2 weeks later they cut off his head on Tower Hill for a manuscript that had never been published, never been finished, and for which the Crown produced no proof of circulation. Somewhere in the Dutch Republic that same autumn, another Englishman was living under a false name in another man's house, with the English government asking for him. He had written a manuscript of his own, making a kindred argument. In the same years and in the same danger, he kept it hidden for 6 more years and then published it without his name on it. Between them, the Martyr and the Philosopher gave the argument from consent, the 2 statements that would carry it across an ocean. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 10 of the series, Self-Evident, The Road to 1776, and today, the Martyr and the Philosopher, Algernon Sidney and John Locke. This episode corresponds to Article 10 of our written series, published this past Sunday on our Substack page. The podcast expands on those themes, provides additional primary sources, and addresses complexities that the written format cannot fully explore. Let us begin.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions Podcast. Here we ask a simple question of the history and the actions that have shaped our lives.
Did this leave us more free or more governed? Because what we do not know can be used to govern us.
And what we choose to ignore always will.
Now, to understand why a private manuscript could kill a man in 1683, you have to understand what England had spent the previous 5 years doing to itself. And I'm going to pause and make a recommendation. If you want a deeper history of the English monarchs, we have built a companion episode available on our website and our YouTube page that runs through all the English monarchs from Henry VIII to George III. Now let's get into some specifics about this particular time period. Charles II had come back to the throne in 1660, and for most of the 2 decades, the Restoration settlement had held. But then, in 1678, a confidence man named Titus Oates announced the discovery of a Catholic conspiracy to murder the king. The Popish plot was, in nearly all of its particulars, a fabrication. It nevertheless produced a national panic, a run of executions of innocent men, and a political crisis that consumed the kingdom because it was detonated on top of a fear that was entirely real. The fear was this: Charles had no legitimate children. The heir to the throne of England was his brother James, and James was an open and committed Catholic. England, therefore, faced the prospect of a Catholic king in an age when everyone could see what a Catholic monarch with absolutist habits looked like, because Louis XIV was across the channel doing just that. Let's be precise about the scope of the fear, though, because it was not yet a fear of Catholic dynasty. James had 2 daughters by his first marriage, Mary and Anne, and both had been raised Protestant. The second exclusion bill proposed to treat James as though he were dead and pass the crown to Mary. What frightened the exclusion men was one Catholic reign, not an unbroken Catholic line. The dynastic fear arrived later, in 1688, when James's second wife bore him a son. So a movement formed in Parliament to exclude James from the succession by statute. 3 times between 1679 and 1681, the exclusion men pressed their bills. 3 times, Charles blocked them, proroguing, dissolving, and finally, at the Oxford Parliament in March of 1681, dissolving Parliament altogether and governing without one for the rest of his reign. The exclusion movement collapsed. Its leader, the Earl of Shaftesbury, fled to Holland and died there. And then, in June of 1683, the government announced the discovery of a plot to ambush and murder the king and his brother at a place called the Rye House. Whether the plot was as advanced as the crown claimed remains disputed. What is not disputed is what the crown did with it. The Rye House revelations became an instrument for destroying what remained of any opposition. Lord William Russell went to the block in July. Warrants went out in a wave through the summer, and one of them, issued in the last week of June, was for Algernon Sidney. That is the setting. Now the enemy. Because both of the men in this episode wrote their great books against the same man, and he had been dead for 30 years. Sir Robert Filmer was an English royalist who died in 1653. His major defense of absolute monarchy, patriarcha, sat in manuscript for decades and was published in 1680. That is, in the middle of the exclusion crisis, when the question of who could lawfully sit on the English throne was the only question anyone was arguing about. The timing made a dead man's book into a live weapon, and it became one of the most important theoretical defenses of hereditary royal authority in the whole crisis. Filmer has to be stated at his strongest here, and Filmer is much stronger than his reputation. His case ran as follows. The fashionable theory that government arises from the consent of free and equal individuals is a fiction and a dangerous one. Look at the actual world instead of the imagined one. No one is born free. Every human being enters life under the power he never chose, the rule of a father. In a family he did not select, subject to rules he never agreed to. Authority is not something individuals construct by agreement. Authority is the condition into which every person is born. And its origin, Filmer argued, is divine and historical at once. God gave Adam dominion over the created world and over his own children. That paternal power, the natural and unquestioned rule of a father over his household, descended through the patriarchs to the kings of the earth, who are, in effect, the fathers of their peoples. A king's command over his children, natural, God-given, and requiring nobody's consent, because no child ever consents to the parent who raises him. Thus, the question Filmer put to the consent theorist has never entirely gone away. When exactly did you consent? Where is the original agreement you speak of? Who signed it? Produce it. Show me one government anywhere on the face of the earth that was founded by a free assembly of equal individuals rather than established by conquest or inheritance or the slow accretion of custom that nobody ever voted on. The state of nature, the social contract, the free and equal individuals choosing their rulers, Filmer called all of it imaginary, supported by neither history nor scripture nor ordinary human experience. The argument describes something real. It still does. You were born into a country under laws written before you existed, enforced by a government you never chose, and you did not sign anything. Filmer's challenge was to name the moment of consent, and you too cannot name it. So stop pretending that consent is what holds the structure up. It was a serious argument, and it demanded a serious answer. Two men gave one. They worked separately. They were writing at the same time, against the same book, and in the same danger. One of them died for it. Algernon Sidney was 60 years old in 1683, and he had spent his life on the losing side of English politics. He had sat in the Long Parliament. He had been named a commissioner for the trial of Charles I and had opposed the king's execution. He had spent long years abroad after the Restoration, out of reach of a government that had not forgotten him. And he had come home under a pardon into a country that regarded him as a permanent danger. What he was writing in the years around the Exclusion crisis was a long, dense, furious refutation of patriarcha. He called it Discourses Concerning Government. It runs to hundreds of pages, but its spine is simple. Filmer's entire edifice rests on a claim about Adam, and the claim about Adam is false. Sidney disputed that God had given Adam any special political dominion at all. But he did not need to win that point, and he knew it. So he granted it for the sake of argument, and then he destroyed the theory anyway. Suppose God did give Adam dominion. Now trace it. Show me the line from Adam to Charles Stuart. There is no such line. There is a fiction dressed up as genealogy. And if paternal authority is genuinely the source of kingship, then follow where that goes. Every father is a king, and the world contains as many sovereigns as it contains households. Filmer cannot have it both ways. Either fatherhood confers sovereignty, in which case sovereignty is everywhere, or it does not, in which case the king has no title from it. Then Sidney turned Filmer's own demand back on him. You accuse the consent theorist of inventing history. Your descent of kings from Adam is the larger invention. Now, with Adam cleared away, the ground was open for Sidney's own position, which he drew from the classical Republican tradition and from a reading of English history as a long record of limited and answerable kingship. Men, Sidney argued, are naturally free. Not free in the sense of living without a government. He was not describing a wilderness. Free in the sense that no man is born in the natural master of another. And no man is bound to obey a power that he or his ancestors did not in some fashion establish or consent to. Government exists for the good of the governed, not for the private benefit of the governor. Its powers are therefore limited by the purpose it exists to serve. And when a ruler breaks those limits, when he governs against the law, against the good of the people, for himself alone, he becomes a tyrant. And the people who establish the government retain the right to resist him. That is the doctrine that cost Sidney his life. And the Crown understood it precisely. A theory that grounds the king's authority in the consent and the good of his people is unavoidably a theory about when that authority may be withdrawn. Filmer's patriarchal king can never be lawfully resisted, any more than a child may lawfully depose his father. Sidney's answerable magistrate can be. The whole question of that age, whether there was a lawful limit to what a king could do and any lawful remedy when he exceeded it, turned on exactly that point. Sidney answered that there was a limit and there was a remedy. He wrote it down, and the writing was used to kill him. Be careful about what he was and was not arguing, because Sidney was not a Democrat in any sense that we would recognize anyway. His republic was a republic of virtuous, propertied, public-spirited men. His admiration ran to the aristocratic republics of antiquity, not to anything resembling universal suffrage. The people in whom he located ultimate authority were not the whole population of England, and he would have been astonished at any suggestion that they would be. What he established, and established with rigor and courage that made him a martyr, was the principle that sits underneath the franchise question. Under God and the natural law, particular governments are established by human beings for their common good. They hold the power on behalf of the governed. They remain answerable to the communities that authorize them. They do not descend by divine hereditary title to a sovereign who answers to no one. Who counts as the governed was a question later generations would press much further than Sidney ever did. That the governed, whoever they turn out to be, are the source of legitimate power rather than its subjects. That was Sidney's contribution, and he sealed it with his death. The warrant for Sidney's arrest was issued in the last week of June 1683. When officers took him, they took his papers, and among the papers was the unfinished manuscript of the Discourses. He was arraigned in the Court of King's Bench on the 7th of November. He was refused counsel and a copy of the indictment, and brought back to the bar on trial on the 21st. Now understand what the Crown's problem was, because the whole case turns on it. English law required that treason be proved by two witnesses to an overt act, an actual deed, not merely an opinion. The government had exactly one witness to the conspiracy itself, Lord Howard of Esric, a man who had bought his own life by informing on his friends and whose word was distrusted by everyone in the room. It had other witnesses to the handwriting and to the papers, but only one to the plot. One witness to the treason was not enough. The law said so, and it said so plainly. The maneuver that closed the gap is usually summarized by saying that the Crown used the book as the second witness. And that summary is close enough for a headline, though not quite right. What actually happened is worse and more precise. The prosecution offered the manuscript and the proof of Sidney's handwriting as evidence of a separate overt act, the act of writing being itself, on this theory, an act of contemplating the king's death. On the Crown's theory, that supplied the missing overt act, and the requirement was satisfied. In substance, and in the judgment of Sidney's defenders ever after, the protection the law had built into the treason was not met. It was engineered around. And Jeffreys gave the jury the rule of law that made it work. To write is to act. Take that rule seriously, as the men in the courtroom did. It means that a manuscript in a drawer is a deed. It means that the sentences you set down in private, never printed, never shown, never finished, are acts of the same kind as raising a sword. It means that a government may search any man's study, read what he thought and believed himself alone, and then hang him for it. Sidney saw it and said so. Take any book apart the way you have taken mine apart, hold the court, and you can prove anything of anyone. Cut up scripture, and you will have David denying God and the apostles drunk. The jury convicted him, and the court condemned him to die. On the morning of the 7th of December, 1683, Sidney walked out onto the scaffold on Tower Hill. He declined to make a speech. The diarist John Evelyn, who sat the scene down soon afterward, records that Sidney told the sheriffs he had made his peace with God and that he had come there not to talk but to die. And then he put one paper onto the sheriff's hand and another into a friend's, said a prayer as long as the grace before a meal, laid his neck on the block, and told the executioner to perform his duty. The paper contained the argument he would not deliver aloud. It ends with a sentence that has outlived the man, the reign, and the axe. We live in an age that maketh truth pass for treason. 6 years later, after the king he was killed for was dead, and the brother who succeeded him had been driven out of the country, Parliament reversed the attainder against Algernon Sidney as wrongful and unjust. The reversal cost the government nothing by then, and it did not restore his life. It is worth noting all the same. It placed the state's own record against the legality of the proceeding that had killed him. In the same summer that the officers were carrying Sidney's papers out of his study, another Englishman read the tea leaves and left the country. John Locke was a physician and philosopher, and for years he had been the confidential advisor and household intimate of the Earl of Shaftesbury, the leader of the Exclusion movement. When that movement collapsed and its leaders began going to the block, Locke's position was not survivable. In the late summer of 1683, he crossed to the Dutch Republic, the same republic whose long fight for its own liberty this series traced back in week 7. And Locke stayed there for more than 5 years. He did not stay comfortably. In Amsterdam, he lodged in another man's house under the assumed name of Dr. van der Linden. For a time, the English government was actively seeking him, and he was in real danger of being handed over. He was 51 years old, in poor health, living under a false name, and waiting. He came home in February of 1689 in the ship that carried the Princess Mary to England. After the revolution had already turned, his letter concerning toleration, written during that exile, was published anonymously that year, in Latin first and then in an English translation made without his knowledge. His great work of political theory appeared late in that same year, with 1690 on the title page, and without his name anywhere on it. He admitted the authorship publicly only in his will. That book is the Two Treatises of Government, and for a very long time, it was read as a victory speech. The reasoning was natural enough. It was published in 1689, the revolution happened in 1688, and therefore the book was taken to be a justification written after the fact, a comfortable defense of a settlement already achieved, produced by a man in no danger whatsoever. Modern scholarship has corrected that picture, beginning with Peter Lassett's landmark edition of 1960. And the correction changes what kind of book you are holding. Most of the Two Treatises was written before the Revolution, substantially during the Exclusion crisis and its immediate aftermath, most likely between 1679 and 1682. Lassett's precise reconstruction has been argued ever since, and the argument continues. The core, though, of the correction has held, which means this was not a victory speech. It was a revolution argument in a losing cause, written when making it openly could have put its author on the same scaffold as Sidney, by a man who carried it into exile and published it only when the danger had passed, and even then without his name on the title page. The systematic calm of the prose conceals the conditions of its composition. The first treaty is a patient, line-by-line demolition of Filmer. It takes Patriarcha apart, tracks the descent of authority from Adam through every joint of the argument, and leaves it in pieces. It reads today as overkill against an opponent nobody defends anymore. It did not read that way in 1681, when Patriarcha was the crown's best theoretical weapon. The second treaty is the one that built the structure the future world would live in, and it's worth laying out in the order Locke laid it out, because it is a great deal of the vocabulary a later revolution would use. Locke begins exactly where Filmer said no one could begin, with human beings as they are by nature, before any government exists. In that state, men are free and equal, not free to do whatever they wish. Locke is emphatic about the state of nature is not a state of license. They are bound by a law of nature, which is reason, and which teaches, in his words, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Rights on this account are not the gift of the government. They exist before government. In the moral structure of the human person, government does not create them. Government is created to protect them. From that root, Locke derived his theory of property, which became one of the most consequential and most contested legacies. Every man, he wrote, has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. That claim supplies the starting point, and from it property in things follows, because a man owns the labor of his own body, and when he applies that labor to something originally given to humankind in common, clearing a field, gathering a harvest, drawing water, he joins something of himself to it, and it becomes his. Two qualifications belong here because Locke put them there. The first is that this premise was not that the world lay ownerless and free for the taking. His premise was that God had given earth to human beings in common, and that individual property arises when labor is mixed with that common stock. The second is that Locke set a limit on a person's dominion over himself. Later thinkers would develop the property in one's own person into a fuller doctrine of self-ownership. But Locke held that human beings are ultimately the workmanship and the property of their maker, and therefore they may not, for example, destroy themselves or wholly enslave themselves. A man owns himself, on Locke's account, as a steward rather than as an absolute proprietor. What matters politically is the conclusion. Property is not a grant from the sovereign, which the sovereign may therefore revoke. It arises from labor, before government and independent of it. And it sets a limit on what any government may rightly do. A ruler who takes his subjects' property at will is not exercising a legitimate power. He is committing the very theft that government exists to prevent. Locke did attach one condition to appropriation, and it is a quiet one, that a man may take from the common store where there is, as he put it, enough and as good left in common for others. Because rights precede government, government can rest on only one legitimate foundation: the consent of those who are to be governed. Men leave the state of nature and form political society for a definite and limited purpose: the better protection of the lives, liberties, and property they already possess. They hand over only the powers required for that purpose. Government, therefore, holds its authority in trust. It is not a master. It is a fiduciary, entrusted with the power for the benefit of the people and bounded by the terms on which the trust was given. And from the idea of trust follows the conclusion that made the book revolutionary in fact and not merely in theory. When a government breaks the trust, when it makes itself arbitrary, seizes the property it was established to protect, and places itself in a state of war with its own people, then power reverts to the people who conferred it, and they may alter or abolish that government and provide for their own safety anew. Locke hedged that right carefully. It is not triggered by every grievance, every mistake, every stretch of bad administration. People do not and should not overturn their governments over small or occasional faults. But a long train of abuses, all tending the same way, aimed at reducing a people under absolute power, that dissolves the trust and returns to the people the authority they had lent. One more thing belongs in this section because it reaches back to the last episode. The letter concerning toleration, written in that Dutch exile, argues that the care of souls is not committed to the civil magistrate. That belief cannot be compelled because coercion can produce conformity but not conviction. And that a commonwealth is constituted for civil interest, life, liberty, health, property, and not for the salvation of the people in it. William Walwyn had argued something close to this in the pamphlet wars of the 1640s and had been called a dangerous man for it. 40 years later, that same argument was coming from the pen of the most systematic philosopher in England, and within another generation, it would be common ground among people who thought of themselves as moderate. That is how things travel. The radical of one generation is the reasonable man of the next. Two reckonings are owed here, one for each man, and the second is harder by a wide margin. Sidney first, because he is the simpler case. The martyr was not a saint. For all the nobility of his death and the rigor of his book, Algernon Sidney took secret money from the French ambassador. 2 payments of 500 guineas in 1678 and again in 1679, while cooperating with the French policy against the English court. He had also sought French support for Republican action during his earlier exile. The absolutist monarch, whose model of kingship stood as the great threat to English liberty, was, at moments, the Republican hero's paymaster. When it became known, it did lasting damage to his reputation, and it should have. The defense that can be offered is real and partial. The subsidies flowed in every direction in the diplomacy of that era. Foreign money moving in domestic policies was ordinary rather than exceptional. Taking a foreign king's coin to advance ends you already held is not the same as selling your convictions to acquire them. That defense does not dissolve the tension and is not offered as though it did. A man who wrote with enormous force against arbitrary power took payment from its most powerful European exemplar. The account holds the courage of the discourses and the compromise of the payments together. Locke's reckoning is deeper, and it cuts much closer to the substance of what he wrote. The philosopher who grounded all legitimate government in the natural freedom and equality of every person was personally and materially entangled in the enslavement of human beings. Locke held shares in the Royal African Company, the chartered corporation at the center of England's trade in enslaved Africans, and in the Bahama adventurers' venture beside it. Recent manuscript research refines how those shares came to him. They appear to have been transferred to him by others rather than purchased as an ordinary personal investment, probably as compensation for his colonial administrative work, and he later divested them. The refinement is worth stating accurately, and it does not erase the connection. He did hold them. And as secretary to the Lords Proprietors in Carolina, Locke copied, revised, and helped administer versions of the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, a proposed foundational constitution for that colony. One of its articles reads that every freeman of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves of what opinion or religion soever. The man who wrote that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions was directly involved as secretary and administrator with versions of a colonial constitutional scheme that entrenched the holding of human beings as property. The juxtaposition gets sharper, not softer, the closer you look at his own text. The very first sentence of the Treatise, the opening line of the work that made him the philosopher of natural freedom, declares that slavery is so vile and miserable an estate of man, and so directly opposite to the generous temper and courage of the English nation, that it is hardly to be conceived that an Englishman, much less a gentleman, would plead for it. And in the second treatise, when Locke defines the only kind of servitude he considers lawful, he defines it as the continuation of a state of war between a lawful conqueror and a captive taken in a just war, a condition that, on his own terms, cannot be inherited, cannot arise from purchase, and cannot be created by a compact, because no man may hand over a power of his own life that he does not possess. Whatever that doctrine licenses, it does not license the hereditary slavery of the Atlantic trade, and it does not license the clause in the Carolina Constitution. So the gap here is not merely between a philosopher's words and a philosopher's conduct. It is between what Locke himself wrote about slavery and what Locke himself administered. That is not a small hypocrisy to be noted and set aside. It is a wound at the center of the liberal tradition, and it will not be honestly dressed by pretending that it is smaller than it is. 2 further points belong here, stated as disputes rather than settled scores. The first is that the degree of Locke's personal responsibility for the Carolina slavery provisions is genuinely contested among historians who have worked with the manuscripts. David Armitage reads him as an active endorser and architect of the colony's slave order. Holly Brewer, working the manuscript evidence, argues that the slavery provisions cannot be securely attributed to Locke's leadership at all, and points instead to the Lords Proprietors and to the Crown, working from charters and models that predated his involvement and outlasted it. The evidence does not resolve clearly, and pretending otherwise in this piece would be dishonest. The second is the harder interpretive question: whether Locke's political philosophy itself was written to rationalize colonial slavery and dispossession, or whether his entanglement was a personal failing at odds with a theory whose own logic condemns it. That is disputed too by serious people in print right now. What is not disputed is the entanglement was real, that it was grave, and that the universal language stood in permanent tension with the author's particular conduct. That tension is the honest place to stand. There is a related difficulty inside the theory itself, and it connects back to the quiet condition on property. Locke justified private appropriation so long as there was enough and as good left in common for others. And he repeatedly used America as his example of land not improved by labor, calling it, in his own vocabulary, waste. That description, whatever Locke intended by it, supplied a ready argument for treating the lands of native peoples as empty and available on the ground that their existing ways of using the land did not count as the kind of labor that established ownership. Whether Locke meant his theory to license colonial dispossession, or whether later readers turned it for that use, is once again disputed. That the argument was available for that use and was used that way is not. Now and only now, the other half of the account. The words Locke wrote, natural freedom, equality, the rights that precede all government, are the words that anti-slavery writers would later turn against slavery with tremendous force. Defenders of slavery also enlisted him selectively, before eventually turning on him. The language proved useful against the very order Locke had helped to build. That the principles prove larger than the man who stated them is the redemptive fact, and it is a real one. It does not come first. What comes first is that a philosopher of universal freedom held shares in human bondage and was directly involved in preparing a slaveholder constitution. Any account that reaches for redemption before it has sat with the offense cheated. And now, 3 objections against my thesis. The first objection is the straight line to Jefferson is too straight. This one attacks the transmission claim before it is even made. The familiar story is too clean by half. Locke wrote it, Jefferson read it, the Declaration echoes it. Therefore, American liberty is Lockean liberty. A generation of scholars has argued that the intellectual world of the American founders was far more crowded than that line suggests. That classical republicanism, the tradition of civic virtue running from the ancient historians through the Renaissance to the English Commonwealthmen, shaped the revolutionary generation at least as powerfully as Lockean natural rights. That Scottish moral philosophy, common law constitutionalism, and dissenting Protestant thought all fed the stream, and that plucking Locke out of that crowd and crowning him the single father of American liberty tells us more about the later admirers than about the founders. On this account, making Locke and Sidney the twin pillars of 1776 builds a tidy genealogy where the truth was a spiderweb. The objection is right about the spiderweb. The reply is not to deny it, but to be exact about what is being claimed. The founders were not simple Lockeans. The American achievement was a synthesis. It's the whole point of this series. Braiding classical, common law, Protestant, and natural rights strands, and not one of those strands stands alone. Locke and Sidney are not the whole of it. What the evidence firmly supports is they were prominent and documented strands, named as such by the founders in their own words, which is a different kind of claim for a resemblance noticed by later admirers, and a much stronger one. The next section lays out those words. The strand is documented, named, and central. It is simply not solitary, and nothing in this episode claims that it is. The second objection I get, Sidney was a factional martyr, not a philosopher of liberty. His martyrdom, the objection says, was real but partly self-made, and his cause was a faction's cause rather than liberty's. He was an aristocrat defending the prerogatives of his class against the crown. He was mixed up in the murky plotting of the Exclusion years. He was funded by a foreign king, and his canonization as a hero of liberty was the work of later Whig propagandists who needed a martyr and found a convenient one. To read Discourses as a monument of freedom is to accept a partisan legend at face value. The facts underneath this objection were conceded in the reckoning. Sidney was an aristocrat. He was entangled in faction. He did take French money. He was elevated into a symbol by admirers with a purpose of their own. But the concession does not reach the argument. And it is the argument that matters. The Discourses stands or falls on its own reasoning, not on the character of the man who wrote it. Its case, that authority derives from the governed and that tyranny may be lawfully resisted, is a general principle and not a factional convenience. Mixed men can state true and important things, and the truth of a proposition does not depend on the purity of a person advancing it. And the manner of Sidney's death gave the principle force no treaties alone could have carried. A government that kills a man for an unpublished book demonstrates thesis about arbitrary power more vividly than any argument he could have written. The third objection, Locke's liberty was a property holder's liberty. This is the sharpest of the three, and it governs directly out of the reckoning. Locke's natural rights, it holds, were in practice the rights of propertied European men, and his philosophy functioned to protect and expand their holdings, including holdings in land taken from native peoples and human beings taken from Africa. His labor theory of property reads on this account less like a charter of universal freedom than like a rationalization of accumulation and dispossession, dressed up in the language of nature and reason. The universalism was a facade. The function was the protection of a particular class's particular interests. This is the objection to respect most because the reckoning already conceded the facts that give it force. Locke was entangled in slavery and colonialism. His theory of property was available as a justification for dispossession. The universal language coexisted with a decidedly non-universal practice. What the objection asserts beyond those facts, that the universalism was a mere facade, that the function exhausts the meaning, is precisely what the subsequent history refuses to confirm. If Locke's language of natural freedom and equality had really been nothing but a property holder's charter, it could not have done the work it went on to do, because it was taken up by anti-slavery and reform movements, and by the people the exclusions had shut out, who turned to Locke's own premises against those exclusions. A facade cannot be used to tear down the building it was built to decorate. That Locke's principles could be and were turned against Locke's own conduct and against his errors and injustices is the strongest evidence available. They were not merely a rationalization to those injustices, but that those words meant more than their author lived up to. That is not a defense of the author, it is a claim about the words. And the history of what was done with them bears it out. Sidney died in 1683. His Discourses concerning government was published 15 years later, in 1698. And it went through edition after edition in that century that followed. Locke's two treatises appeared at the end of 1689, dated 1690, and became, over the next several generations, one of the most quietly influential books in the English-speaking world. Both men had written in danger, in the shadow of defeat, for a cause that appeared in 1683 to have failed completely. Both were read, in the fullness of time, by people they could never have imagined in a country that did not yet exist. By the middle of the 18th century, Sidney and Locke were fixtures in the libraries and arguments of educated colonial Americans. Benjamin Franklin, printing his almanac for the year 1750, marked the 7th of December with a note on it that said, on that day in 1683, the Honorable Algernon Sidney was beheaded, charged with a pretended plot, but whose chief crime was the writing of an excellent book. That is a Philadelphia printer 67 years after the fact, telling ordinary colonial readers on a page they kept in the kitchen that a man was killed for writing a book. When the quarrel with Britain drove the colonists to search for the principles on which to ground resistance, these were among the books they reached for, and they said so, which is what makes this transmission a matter of record rather than resemblance. In 1825, an old man at Monticello asked what the Declaration had rested on. Jefferson answered that the document was not meant to be original. that it was intended to be an expression of the American mind, and that its authority rested on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, expressed, he said, in the elementary books of public right. And he named them Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney. 20 years earlier, he had called Sidney's Discourses probably the best elementary book on the principles of government founded in natural right ever published in any language. And in March of that same year, 1825, the Board of Visitors of the new University of Virginia met to settle which books would teach the principles of government to the students of the young republic. Jefferson was the rector. James Madison was in the room. They resolved on the general principles of liberty and the rights of man in nature and in society, the doctrines of Locke's essay on civil government and Sidney's Discourses might be considered as those generally approved by their fellow citizens. That is not a genealogy imposed by later admirers. That is Jefferson identifying his own sources in writing in the last year of his active life and in the governing board of Jefferson's University with Madison in the room, placing Locke and Sidney among the authoritative texts for teaching the principles of government to the next generation. The reservation entered a moment ago still holds, prominent and documented strands, not the whole cloth, but within the synthesis, this thread is bright, traceable, and acknowledged by the men who wrote it. Time to apply the liberty test. Locke's standard is unusually easy to state and unusually hard to apply. Government holds its powers in trust for the protection of rights the governed already possessed. Its authority extends only to the powers the governed could actually have handed over, for the purposes for which they handed them over. Everything beyond that is not authority at all. Take that standard to any law or policy you like in any country you like, including this one. Could the government have delegated this power? Not did they, back during some ancestor's life, but could they? Is this a power that free people, protecting what was already theirs, would have placed in a government's hands on any terms they would have accepted? That question has real teeth, and it cuts in directions that will not comfort any particular faction. Now the difficulty, because here's the serious one, and Filmer would have pressed it hardest. Locke's remedy, that a long train of abuses dissolves the trust and returns power to the people, is a standard with no umpire. Who decides the train is long enough? Who decides that the abuses all tend the same way? Every faction that has ever wanted to overthrow a government it lost an election to has been able to describe its grievances as a long train of abuses. The doctrine that justified 1688 and 1776 is the same doctrine available to any well-organized minority convinced of its own righteousness. A right of revolution with no neutral judge is either the ultimate protection against tyranny or a permanent invitation to disorder, depending on who is holding it. Locke knew that, which is why he hedged. The hedges are honest, and they are not a solution. So here's the question, and it is genuinely open. When you judge that a government has exceeded the powers its people could have delegated, what follows? What does that conclusion actually entitle you to do? And by what standard would you know that you had judged rightly rather than merely lost an argument? Answer it while you are winning, not only while you are losing. That is the harder version and is the one worth having. The Martyr and the Philosopher answered Filmer's hard question. When did you consent? Where is the agreement? Their answer was not to produce a signed contract from the dawn of history. It was to reground the question entirely. Authority is legitimate only where it serves the governed and rests, however imperfectly, on their consent. And it forfeits its claim when it turns against them. Sidney sealed that answer with his death. Locke built it into a system that a later age would quarry for a century. The argument that the levelers had raised in the streets and the barracks now had its rigorous and enduring statement. Two statements, written independently against the same enemy in the same years at the same risk. One man escaped into exile. The other man's papers fell into the government's hands, and the government killed him with them. But an argument on paper, however rigorous, is not yet a change in the world. In December of 1683, standing on Tower Hill or hiding in Amsterdam, neither man had any reason to believe the cause would survive them. Neither of them could have predicted how fast the wheel would turn. Within 5 years, the king Sidney died under would be dead. His Catholic brother would sit briefly on the throne and would be driven off of it with comparatively little fighting in England, though the wider revolution brought armed conflict to Scotland and a full war to Ireland. The settlement that followed did not enact Sidney's system or Locke's wholesale. It placed statutory and political restraints on royal power, and it secured inherited constitutional rights in a written instrument. What it created was an order in which the arguments that had been treason in 1683 could circulate openly, safely, and with force. The theory was about to meet its moment. Next Saturday, episode 11, The Glorious Revolution. The settlement that placed fresh limits on the crown, the Bill of Rights of 1689, and the constitutional order that Locke lived to see and to defend. And this Tuesday, in our contemporary application, we take up the rule that killed Algernon Sidney. To write is to act. Private writing, the reach of the modern state into what a person believed was his own. What happens to liberty when the record of your thinking is permanent, searchable, and in somebody else's hands. This is the road to 1776, and we are still walking it. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 10 of Self-Evident, The Road to 1776 on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you will find all written articles. You will find them organized into series that you can scan through and read them, watch them in any order you choose. We have series on the General Welfare Clause, the New Leviathan, and the Empire of Liberty series. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. Any subscription, like, or follow sincerely helps us in reaching other viewers through the algorithms. And follow me on X at jkellick for updates, discussion, back and forth, announcements, whatever we want to do on X. And we continue to post articles and welcome your participation. I do thank you for watching. I greatly appreciate it. Until next time, have a great day.